Hello, so today I am making a tutorial that would really have helped me when I first started painting with watercolors. And this is how to make a good backing board so that you can stretch your watercolors and not have them wrinkle up. When I was in my first year at college, I really struggled to find a good, cheap, reasonably priced tutorial on how to do this. So here we go. The things you're going to need are a foam board. I got this one at, I believe, Michael's or Hobby Lobby, one of them, I don't know. But you want it to be at least 1/4 of an inch thick. I think, yeah, this is 1/4 of an inch thick. If you have a thick, oops, I'm sorry if you heard that. That is my ruler slamming against the wall. If you have a thicker one, so I have this other one that I'm going to tape eventually. This one is a half, oh, you can't even see it, but this one's a 1/2 inch thick. This one's just bigger because what you're gonna do to stretch your watercolor paper is you're gonna use a stapler. And you want the staples, well, this one's gonna be, I can use this one on both sides at the same time because it's thick enough that the staples won't go all the way through. Whereas with this one, the staples will kind of go through a little bit, so you can only do one side at a time, but that's how it's going to work. Let me show you a completed backing board that I have used. Whoops, dropped something, that's okay. That I have used already for one of my pieces. This is it. It is, I'm literally just going to tape it over with duct tape. Bring out your 2010s duct taping skills. If you're like me, grew up in that era. And you can see what the holes where the staples were. And they did kind of go through to the other side. You can faintly see the row, but this is what we're gonna make. A lot of artists, when I was looking up a tutorial like this, they were like, oh, you need to get this certain board and you have to prep it this certain way. This is a cheap method, clearly. This was maybe I got a 4-pack for $7. Not bad. And I already had the duct tape. Duct tape's what, $5 a roll? I would recommend a neutral color, either black or gray or white, because you're going to be painting directly on this board. And all you're going to do is you're going to wrap the duct tape around this whole piece. Again, just like this one. What we're going to do is we're going to make it waterproof. So that way when we put our pieces on the board, we don't have to worry about water seeping through into the board and then warping the board. I did experiment with this process with a few other boards. The one where I put the paper directly on the board and then got it wet and stapled it down. It was so warped, I had to throw it away. So what we're going to do is we are going to duct tape this board, and because that sound is really annoying, I'm going to switch to a time lapse for this. So go ahead and follow along. All right, I'm gonna pause real quick because I thought of something else that I would recommend. Starting with the edges, just for simplicity's sake, and you may have seen me put the board vertically, that's so I can make sure it was in the middle of the tape. I'm sealing around the edges, pressing down. You want this to be, while you're taping, you want it to be flat as possible. You do not want air bubbles. So I'm smoothing them out right here. This is gonna eventually fold over and be wrapped around. Maybe I'll trim it short. So you'll also need some scissors. I'm assuming you already have scissors if you're watching this video and you want to do watercolors. You're probably well stocked on art supplies. And if you need something to make the bubble, to make sure you don't get bubbles, I would recommend a straight edge of some sort. This is literally the first thing I could grab. I'm digging through my art supplies right now. But also an old credit card or an old gift card would work. Where did I put them? I apologize for the sniffing. It's the change in weather. It just got really warm here. My dog is actually sitting outside right now. But yes, here's an old gift card that you can use to smooth out the tape as you're rolling it down, which you'll probably see me demonstrate in the next time lapse. So yeah, start with the edges, make sure everything's flat. You do not want air bubbles in this. And also, you're going to want to overlap your duct tape by like maybe at least 1/4 of an inch while you're wrapping it around. Here, you can clearly see the places where I overlap the tape because we're going to want to make sure this board is as waterproof as possible. Okay, back to the time lapse. All right, I'm glad I chose to do the small board first. I'm almost out of duct tape, but here we go. You can see it's not perfect. It doesn't have to be perfect. We just want those overlaps so that the water doesn't seep into the foam, because then it will absolutely warp. Just gonna trim up some edges here. And that took me like less than 10 minutes. So if you have a board that's about this size, it really won't take you long at all. This method also did come through a little bit of trial and error. Again, as I mentioned earlier, I did try to do this with just the board to see if I had to waterproof it. Definitely did. I tried it with packing tape and then duct tape. Packing tape did seep into the board a little bit, but I think there's just something with duct tape that stops water from leaking through. It is a waterproof tape, but the extra layers, the thickness of the tape prevents it from getting all the way into the board. Again, this is another board that I already had made, and it hasn't warped at all. And I use a lot of water whenever I prep a surface. So now that we have that done, I'm going to give you some advice on how to tape down and stretch watercolor paper. I entirely forgot my water paper out, so here we go. So this is Canson watercolor paper. Now, if you clicked on this video, you might know about how to stretch watercolor paper already, but if not, let me explain. So when we use watercolor, we use, well, clearly, water. And when you put water on the paper, the fibers inside the paper start to relax and they spread out. And then when it dries, it shrinks in again. That uneven, okay, so like if you only did the background, like you only did the top of the paper and you were doing like a pretty watercolor sky or whatever. I love watercolor skies. I just created a whole series of them. But if you created like a watercolor sky in the background and you left this part dry, this part of the paper would expand and then shrink, and it would dry at an uneven rate compared to the bottom part. And that's what causes warping in your paper. So in the past, I used to just like tape my paper down on a board or on my table or whatever with regular old painter's tape. But that still leaves the borders of your paper dry. So then everything else will kind of bubble up as you're painting. And then as it dries, it like kind of flattens out, but then it's still warped. So this is why I really like this method of stretching my watercolor paper, because I've also tried it with using gum tape on a surface. Gum tape is tape that's activated by water. So it would, you know, flatten out. I'd stretch my paper, get it all wet and soaking like I'm about to show you, and then the paper would still be warped. I got really frustrated. So what we're going to do, you really only need a few supplies for this. If you have access to like a sink, this might be a little bit easier. Another thing I used to do was to soak my watercolor paper in like an aluminum tray As long as it's not dusty, you can do that. Just like dip the paper in, let it soak for about 30 seconds, lift it up, and then you would roll it down flat. But my new studio does not have a sink in it, so it would be very difficult for me to do that whole process. So in order to stretch your watercolor paper, you're going to need a few things. A stapler, that'll be the last thing to use. Water, this is just clean water in my little jar that I made. Some paper towels I would recommend because it's going to get a little wet around here. And then something to spread the water. So I used to use this brush all the time, this sponge, literally like a Dollar Tree sponge, okay? As long as it's clean. And then I also have like my good old reliable paintbrush. It's been through a lot. But that's another option if you don't have a brush like this. This is my new, semi-new, I got it a few months ago, squirrel hair, synthetic squirrel hair watercolor brush. It holds so much water, so I'm going to be using this, but just know that you can also use any other materials that you just happen to have on hand. Again, this is like a thrifty version of stretching watercolor paper. You really don't need anything fancy. You don't need a $40 board or anything. Okay, so what we're going to do is I like to start with the back of the paper, and we're going to soak the paper, lay it down flat, and then staple it in place. The staples hold so much better than tape. You're literally poking holes into the paper. However, when doing this method, you have to know that the border of your paper will have staple holes in it, so just account for that whenever you're sketching out your piece. So I'm going to start with the back. We just want like as much water as possible. I am looking at the reflections of the light on this paper. Like you can already see it's starting to warp. We're just going to soak it all. Soak the whole thing. You want it to be evenly coated with water. Again, if you had a sink within access and like a flat tray for your paper, you could just dip the paper in the tray, let it soak for about 30 seconds, and then pull it up and let it be flat. But since I don't have a sink, I'm doing it the hard way. Okay, that's really soaked. You see it's warping already. This is normal. And then I'm going to kind of lay it flat, and we're going to soak the front of it. If you've ever seen those like old videos and stuff of people like painting posters onto a wall, that's what I like to think of, except for we're just using water here. You want your paper to be literally soaked with water. We are going to soak all of the fibers on this paper. Apologies for the sniffling. Again, there's been a big change in weather, so my body's like, huh? It was like negative degrees this week, and now it is almost 50 today. Okay. So I've got a lot of water here. I'm not sure if you can see like all the puddles. Yeah. Lots of water. However, we don't want this paper to be unevenly coated with water. Remember how earlier I said like the paper will dry unevenly if there's water in one place and not another. So I'm missed a spot here. Making sure that the whole thing is absolutely soaked. And you want it to be, this is like, woo! I don't know what sort of texture this paper would be considered, but we're gonna let it dry a little. I'm gonna drip off all the excess water. And then this is where you're gonna need, apologies, that was loud, your paper towel. Soak up the excess water on the board. I can just flip it over, but I want to staple this to this side. Okay. That's good enough. I got water everywhere. This is a very wet process. And then what you're going to want to do is roll it down so that it stays flat. This way there's no air bubbles underneath. And it's kind of sticking to the board on its own right now. But now we staple. I always like to start with the corners. I got a stapler that pops out, and it's also quite loud. I'll start with the corners and then work my way inwards. Okay, and now I would recommend letting this dry overnight or for 8 hours, or as long as, I almost said as long as it takes, but like, it'll take a while. I already have an air bubble over here. But as the paper shrinks, the staples will keep it pulled outwards. So that way this air bubble might go away. This might just be a little bit too much water in there. You can kind of see the bumps where the duct tape overlaps underneath. Those will go away, I promise. So let me see if I can find, I'm not going to show the front of this because it's a surprise, but this is one of the pieces that I used on the other board that I've already made, and it is quite smooth. It's really not warped at all, especially compared to like if I had just taped it down. But yeah, that's literally it. This is the best way that I have learned how to tape my watercolor paper down. And as you can see, you really should adjust your layout for your painting so that there's a border on the paper. You can also sketch out your piece before you staple it down. Just make sure you use like really light pencil or colored pencil or whatever you use. Make sure it's really light, because you won't be able to erase once you stretch your paper. I have also drawn my piece before I stapled it down. But once you get to the end, once it's all dry and your painting's all done, you can either use, what have I used? I've used an X-Acto knife to pop up the staples. I bought myself a staple remover to pop up the staples because I got tired of the knife. And you just throw them away and it's all done. Yeah, this is this is a video I wish I could have given to myself about 5 or 6 years ago. Just so I wouldn't have to struggle so hard to get watercolor pieces to lay flat. I hope it was easy to follow along with, and best of luck on your watercolor painting journey. Bye.